remarks, I generally have in mind the United States and Israel. It's important, particularly for Americans, to recognize that virtually everything that Israel does is with the decisive support, often direct participation of the United States. That's economic, military, diplomatic, and not least ideological, the way the issues are framed in the United States quite differently from elsewhere. And when Washington draws the line, Israel obeys. No choice. Right now, Israel is facing a pretty severe crisis, in fact, a double crisis, a crisis of legitimation and a crisis of delegitimation. Those are the terms they use. And they're both matters of pretty serious concern. The issue of legitimation is coming to a head in the next few months at the United Nations. Palestine is appealing to the UN to recognize Palestine as a Palestinian state and also to admit Palestine to the United Nations. The U.S. administration is pulling every string it can to try to prevent it, but it looks as if they may do it. It could come up as early as September. If it comes to the Security Council, the United States will almost certainly veto it, as it usually does. The most recent veto was 3 months ago, February. And that one was a kind of an interesting one. It actually got some attention. Most vetoes don't, for one thing, because there's so many of them. But it's rarely recognized how isolated the U.S. is at the UN on a whole range of issues. The last one did get some notice because it was a little unusual. The Obama administration vetoed a resolution affirming Obama's official policy. And that got some notice. The resolution called for an end to settlement expansion in the West Bank, which theoretically is supposed to be Obama's policy, but the U.S. vetoed it. If you want to read something embarrassing, take a look at Ambassador Susan Rice's explanation. I thought you should have had the dignity to resign. The resolution also had another aspect that it declared the settlements in the West Bank illegal, and of course the Golan Heights, which nobody talks about, regarded them, it declared that they're illegal. And it's important to recognize that that's uncontroversial. In fact, Israel itself recognized that back in late 1967. It recognized its highest legal authorities advised it. The Attorney General agreed that any transfer of population into the occupied territories is in violation of the core principles of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Agreements. And technically, the Israeli Supreme Court also recognizes it, but they find various ways around it. It's repeatedly been recognized by the Security Council, and then most recently, a few years ago, by the International Court of Justice, the World Court, with the U.S. Justice in a separate declaration affirming the conclusion that this was technically about the separation wall, affirming that any part of the separation wall, it's about 85%, that's there in order to protect Israeli settlements, is de facto in violation of international law because the settlements are illegal. So that part's not really controversial. The other part of the resolution was reaffirming official U.S. policy, but Obama decided to veto it. The General Assembly in the coming session is a little different. The United States can't veto General Assembly resolutions, so it'll probably be another one of the familiar resolutions. Again, not just on Israel, on a whole range of topics. Overwhelming, it rarely gets reported, but there's vote after vote, which is 180 to 3 or something like that. The U.S., Israel, sometimes some Pacific island or something like that. And sometimes it's even worse. Sometimes 150 to 1 the United States. So it'll probably happen again. It probably won't get reported. Recognition of Palestine is already quite overwhelming, including important countries like Brazil, which is the most respected, influential country in the South, other South American countries, and quite a few others. In fact, Palestine is now recognized by about over 100 countries, including about 85–90% of the world's population. That's far more than recognize Kosovo. But in the case of Kosovo, the admission to the United Nations is implemented because there's only one vote that counts in a world that's run by force and violence, not law. That's the one with the big stick. So the United States supports Kosovo, so therefore it's in whatever the world thinks. And the United States opposes Palestine, so it's out whatever the world thinks. Well, those are important things to remember. The United States, in fact, is a declining power for a lot of interesting reasons, many of them internally self-inflicted, but it's happening. And it may not be able to hold back the tide forever, even though it's got Canada and a good part of Europe kind of toddling along politely, for the moment at least. In Israel, the government and political commentators refer to the coming votes at the United Nations as a tsunami that they're going to have to do something about. And they're flailing around to decide what they might do. It could be dangerous. It's an unpredictable, violent state with plenty of force behind it. And it has a doctrine, goes back to the 1950s. The doctrine back to the 1950s is that if we're pressed too far, we'll go crazy. Mishtageh is the Hebrew. Now, back in the 1950s, there weren't a lot of ways they could do that. But by the late 60s, there are. It's a powerful nuclear state. They might do all kinds of things. I hate to think about it, but one possibility is another attack on Gaza. There's bombing of Iran. Who knows what they'll do. But something might happen. I suppose they don't know themselves, but so of course we can only speculate. That's the legitimation of the tsunami. It took another step forward just a couple days ago with the unification of Hamas and Fatah under Egyptian initiative, and that's important. The fact that it was Egyptian initiative and it went forward is a reflection of the really quite dramatic, spectacular changes that have been taking place in the Arab world and North Africa in the last couple of months. The Arab Spring, as it's called. And this example, the unification, is one of the many reasons why Israel and the United States are deeply concerned about what they correctly regard as the growing threat of democracy in the Arab world. In this particular case, from 1991, the U.S. and Israel have been dedicated to separating Gaza and the West Bank, breaking them apart. That's in direct violation to the Oslo Accords signed right at the same time, which declare them to be a territorial unity. Well, the unification might impede and might even reverse this process of the separation of the two parts of Palestine, and even more dangerous, the unification might undermine Washington and all of these dedicated efforts to prevent any political settlement, any diplomatic settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict. That settlement, the terms of that settlement are very well understood, supported by essentially the entire world, including Iran. Hamas just reiterated its support for it. Virtually everyone's a unified unification. It's been prevented for 35 years now by the United States primarily, and of course by Israel. Again, important to recognize. I'll come back to it. Well, that's basically the crisis of legitimation. There's also a crisis of delegitimation that Israel's facing, and that's the term that's used when you read, say, the Israeli press. That process of delegitimation was carried forward last December when Human Rights Watch, which is a pretty cautious conservative organization, Human Rights Watch, I'll quote, called on the United States to suspend financing to Israel in an amount equivalent to the costs of Israel's spending in support of settlements. So cut back any U.S. support that goes to the settlements. And also called on the U.S. to monitor contributions to Israel from tax-exempt U.S. organizations that violate international law, including prohibitions against discrimination. Now that casts a very wide net for those of you who know the details of this. In the background, there's also Amnesty International had already called for an arms embargo on Israel. It's using arms and U.S. arms in violation of international law, actually violation of U.S. law too. In the background, there's also a popular movement of divestment from anything involving the occupied territories in the United States. Crucially, that includes major U.S. corporations like, say, Caterpillar, which provides the equipment for the destruction of the West Bank for illegal construction, also for straight murder. The Rachel Corrie case includes Motorola, another major corporation, which is providing electronic systems for the illegal separation wall, again, uncontroversially illegal, and for the settlements, all illegal, and many others. And this is also extending beyond to the broader boycotts. So that's the crisis of delegitimation alongside the crisis of legitimation. And you can see why it's considered, a tsunami, something very dangerous and might elicit an unpredictable and maybe a very dangerous response. Well, there's a good reason why the United States fears democracy in the Arab world. To find out why, all you have to do is to take a look at polls of Arab public opinion. They're certainly known to planners, but they're not published here. And I presume they're not published because the press doesn't want you to know what people think. I can't think of any other reason. It's hard to think of anything more important at this stage with what's going on in the Arab world than what Arab public opinion is. I mean, you hear a lot about what the Arab dictators say, but you don't hear about what the public thinks, and that's very revealing. So what is the public? The polls, incidentally, are taken by the leading U.S. polling agencies, the most prestigious ones. They're released by major institutions, Brookings Institute and so on. It's inconceivable that the media don't know about them, and planners certainly do. And they're interesting. So, for example, in Egypt, the most important country in the Arab world, about 90% of the population regard the United States as their main enemy, main threat that they face. Opposition to U.S. policy is so strong that in Egypt, about 80% think the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons. Not just nuclear energy, but nuclear weapons. Maybe 10% regard Iran as a threat. And the figures are a little different country by country, but that's roughly the story throughout the Arab world. So you can see very clearly why the U.S. and its allies, Israel, of course, and the Western allies, cannot tolerate democracy in the Arab world. Not authentic democracy, at least, the kind of democracy in which public opinion would have some impact on policy. I mean, if it did, the United States not only wouldn't control the region, which has been a primary goal for 70 years, but it would be driven out. And that's no small thing. It's a major concern has been to maintain control of the energy reserves of the world concentrated there. So, of course, the U.S. and its allies are very frightened of democracy in the Arab world. Of course, they talk about democracy. Stalin talked about democracy too. They can't possibly accept it. We'll do anything to block it. And if you look closely at the policies towards the various uprisings, you see it clearly. Come back to that if you like. It should bear in mind that there's nothing new about this. This goes way back. And there's plenty of evidence about it, plenty of documentation, should be on the front pages of the newspapers, certainly should be taught in schools. So let's go back, say, to the 1950s. In 1958, in then classified, since then declassified documents, internal documents, President Eisenhower, 58, raised with his staff a problem that bothered him. He said he was concerned about what he called the campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, and not by the governments, which are more or less supportive, but by the people. And wanted a discussion of this. Well, right at that time, the National Security Council, which is the highest planning body, came out with a memorandum in which they analyzed that situation. They said there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports dictatorships, harsh, brutal dictatorships, and blocks democracy and development, and that we do this because we want to maintain control of their energy resources. And it went on to say that the perception is more or less accurate, and furthermore, that's what we ought to be doing, because we want to control it and democracy would get in the way. Well, that was 1958. Fast forward to 2001, it's plenty in between, but I'll skip it. Right after 9/11, George W. Bush made a pathetic speech in which he asked, why do they hate us? I don't know. His answer was, they hate our freedoms. This was a study by the Pentagon Research Group, Defense Science Board, which I don't think is reported here, but they essentially reiterated what the National Security Council said in 1958. They said they don't hate our freedoms, they hate our policies. And then they went through essentially the same policies, they haven't changed. What they should have said is, we hate their freedoms, and we hate their freedoms for a really good reason. If they're free, we're not going to be able to carry out these policies, and we want them. And we're beginning to see that. There's a doctrine which was articulated pretty well by former Jordanian high official Marwan Muasher, who's the Middle East specialist, special research specialist for the Carnegie Endowment, right during the Arab uprisings. He said that this general principle, which is that as long as everything's quiet, as long as the population is under control, then the powerful can ignore the population, do anything they like. That's, call it the Muasher doctrine. A very, very wide application. Actually, it applies within the United States as well, rather crucially. So the Muasher doctrine holds, and therefore we don't care about the campaigns of hatred. We don't care that they hate us. We hate their freedoms for good reasons. We'll ignore the polls. All of this became pretty dramatically clear here just in the last few months with WikiLeaks exposures. Of all the WikiLeaks exposures, the one that got the most publicity, big headlines, a lot of euphoric commentary, that was that the Arabs support U.S. policy on Iran. And that's a core U.S. policy now, isolating, undermining Iran. And the Arabs support us. That was the headline, a lot of clapping and so on. Well, they were talking about the Arab dictators. What about the population? Like I said, the population, about 10% think Iran is a threat, and a considerable majority think the region would be better off if they had nuclear weapons. But under the Muasher doctrine, it doesn't matter. As long as they're suppressed by the dictatorships that we back, or somehow silenced, then we can do what we like. And if the Arab dictators support us, who cares about anyone else? Now that's strikingly, not just the diplomatic record, that's the press, that's the intellectual community, the whole intellectual community. Just read the commentary on this and see. General assumption, maybe they'd like to have Iran have nuclear weapons, but as long as the dictators are with us, who cares? As long as they're quiet. That's the prevailing attitude right through the whole educated, articulate community, not just on this issue. And as I said, it holds domestically as well, worth thinking about. Different topic. Well, the Arab Spring has had a number of effects already. One of them I just mentioned. Egypt did move forward to bring about the unification that the U.S. and Israel are quite concerned about. That's only one thing. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, Egypt, the new Egypt, allowed Iranian ships through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean. Now, that is the first time that's ever happened, and the U.S. and Israel don't like it. The Mediterranean's our lake, not anyone else's, and they broke with that. It looks as if they're going to move to open the Gaza border. The closing of the Gaza border, participating in the Israeli siege, is very unpopular in Egypt. And it looks as if Egypt is taking some steps now to open the border, which would break the siege. And that's critical. In the background is another question, which is uncertain. There is a treaty, Egypt-Israel Treaty, 1979, which is also extremely unpopular in Egypt among the population. If you read about it here, there's a lot of concern that they may weaken it or maybe even rescind it. The way it's described here is literally, New York Times, that the treaty is very important because it helps preserve stability in the region. That's a very interesting commentary, because what the treaty does is preserve instability in the region. And that's very clear and explicit. As soon as the treaty was signed, 1979, Israel recognized, it's obvious, but they, of course, also recognized that with the treaty with Egypt, the main Arab deterrent is out of the game. Egypt is by far the main military force, the only big organized military force in the region. So with the Arab deterrent gone, Israel's free to proceed with its policies elsewhere. It's kind of trivial. They can expand illegal settlement in the occupied territories, and critically, they can attack their northern neighbor, Lebanon. And that was recognized right away. You read Israeli strategic analysts, I.MOV and others. They said straight off, look, we didn't like the treaty much, but it has a good side. We're free to do what we like, because there's no deterrent any longer. And right away, Israel planned its invasion of Lebanon. A couple years later, total fakery about pretexts, go into it if you like. And it was no small thing. The invasion of Lebanon in 1982 killed maybe 20,000 people, devastated southern Lebanon, destroyed a large part of Beirut. It finally got so bad that the U.S. was backing it all the way. Reagan thought it was great, that they backed it. However, it got to the point where, even Thomas Friedman, who, and this is going pretty far, he was a reporter in Beirut, and it kind of dawned on him that having bombs drop on you isn't a lot of fun. So he started writing critical comments about the bombing. Okay, now we're at the outer limits. And it was becoming really an international scandal. So Reagan kind of ordered Israel to terminate it in mid-August 1982. A lot of horrors happened after that, like Sabra Shatila, another story. And Israel, of course, had to obey. They have no choices, even though Menachem Begin, the prime minister, was talking at the time about how Hitler's hiding in his bunker, and we got to go after him. It's Yasser Arafat. But the boss said no, so they stopped and went off and did something else, the Sabra Shatila massacre. So in fact, the treaty contributes to instability in the region. But in the technical terms of U.S. political discourse, that's stability. Stability means something that we like. Instability is something we don't like, literally. And so, for example, you take a look at Iran. The big threat of Iran now is that they're destabilizing the region. And how are they destabilizing it? They're trying to expand their influence into neighboring countries, Afghanistan and Iraq. When we invade and occupy and destroy those countries, that's stabilization. When they try to expand their influence into the neighboring countries, that's destabilization. And that makes perfect sense if you own the world. And that is the basic assumption of U.S. culture. We own the world. If anybody's in the way, they're doing something wrong. It's such a level that you can even get things like this. A couple of years ago, the former editor of Foreign Affairs in the Establishment Journal, James Chase, a liberal, sensible liberal commentator, was writing about the U.S. Overthrow of the parliamentary regime in Chile, installation of a brutal dictatorship. And he literally said, reluctantly, we had to destabilize Chile in order to bring about stability. Nobody saw that as a contradiction, and they're right. It's not. We had to destabilize it in order to bring about our rule under a dictatorship, which is by definition stability. So that's what it means when the New York Times and others tell us that the peace treaty is the foundation of stability of the region. It's the foundation of our rule of the region. But the Egyptians may not go along with that, so we'll see. The isolation of the U.S. on these issues is quite significant and should be talked about in a free society. So take, say, Iran again. Iran is the centerpiece of U.S. policy. This last year was called the Year of Iran. In the foreign policy journals, Iran is the major issue. The story is that Iran is isolated. The international community is isolating Iran. But who's the international community? Well, that's another technical term, like stability. The international community is, of course, the United States. And anybody who's going along with it, like Israel, maybe, or some Marshall Islands, that's the international community. So take a look at Iran. The non-aligned countries, which is most of the world, have been vigorously supporting Iran's right to develop nuclear energy. They've been doing that for years, but they're not part of the international community. The Arab world not only supports the right to develop nuclear energy, they actually go so far as to support Iranian nuclear weapons. So the Arab world is not part of the world, the international community. The leading countries of the world, like again Brazil, the most respected country, they strongly object to U.S. policy on Iran. Turkey, the major regional power, they object to U.S. policy. In fact, Turkey and Brazil have recently just worked out a deal to handle the uranium enrichment policy. The U.S. quickly shut it down because they don't want anything getting out of their hands. So they're not part of the international community. In fact, the international community in this case is the United States, Israel, Canada, and large parts of Europe. That's the international community. That's pretty isolated. Incidentally, we might ask, what is this Iranian threat that we're so worried about? Actually, the Iranian government's a rotten government, and it's a terrible threat to its own population.